Hey everybody, I am Ashley Barnhart
And I am Joe, her dad.
and we're here together for the second time, but our third
Third
podcast.
podcast, yes.
And I'm making some waves with my Vivek hat over here, but we're going to talk about some fun stuff today. Welcome to Growing Pains, a podcast about growth.
Growth. So, what are we going to talk about today,
We
Ashley?
are going to talk about something that absolutely everybody can connect with. I've never met anybody in my entire life, and I've met a lot of people who have never experienced the fear of what other people think. And I think we go through life and we get better at this, ideally, not worrying about what our identity is in someone else's mind. But with identity being such a big
Big issue.
issue topic these days, we wanted to kind of tackle it from our perspective and add a little bit of
Insight
insight.
into how to do it in a way that would be very, uh, functional, hopefully, ideally
Ideally,
functional,
yeah.
because everybody today is all about expressing your identity.
And being an individual.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if there's one thing about our culture that you could say identifies our culture in a nutshell is I want to be me, you know?
Me.
Yeah. Or as the
And
commercial says, you be you.
right, you do you.
You do you. Right.
Right.
And so the difficult thing is how do you know when you are you? That's the real question.
Right, and I think that's the struggle. Right? I think when we look at the process of birth to death,
Right.
which it's a process, it begins with, and there's stages of this,
Right.
not knowing who you are, despite what everyone is saying that
Right.
infants can identify certain ways. Y'all don't get me started. Truth, one truth. Um, but we go through life and we go through these stages and we change and we connect with different people and we have different experiences that can help all of that evolve.
Right.
And the hope is that you get to a place where you don't care about what other people think of you and you can stand firmly in your character and your beliefs and your values.
Yes. Well, it's not that you don't care about what other people think about you. It's that you are able to express your opinion and who you are without being dependent upon another person's
Approval.
approval of you, their feelings, their thoughts, or actions of you.
Mm-hmm.
And so, which is really crucial to the ability to develop. So, as you're saying, that people do go through developments, right? And so, when you think about that developmental period, you can think about yourself as a child growing up and how you didn't know anything. And you were brought into a world with really not a lot of, uh, very little knowledge about who you are and how you're supposed to act.
Mm-hmm.
There are things that are hardwired, but for the most part, and from my particular belief system, there's an environment that you grow up in and that you really learn. And I mean, there's the question of nature and nurture,
Sure.
and there is the nurture aspect, but I am just so amazed by how much nurture can can impact a person
Absolutely.
in their and you know we have the neuroplasticity that causes us to be a certain way and develop and to even change, and how it's important to be flexible and allow that neuroplasticity to continue to occur.
Well, and synaptic pruning, right?
Right, exactly.
Right, which is the process of deleting. Your brain actually will delete these old neural pathways, which is just an incredible thing. I think it's just
So
amazing.
without
But
getting too, I mean, it's
scientific
this well, yes, and too scientific
nerds.
and too complex. Um, the process of development begins when you are born, and you begin to um, mimic the environment you're experiencing as a child.
Yes.
And then so we have these neurons in our brains that begin to reflect the input that we're getting from the environment. And
Hmm.
so when your mother or your father comes up to you and says, like, does the baby talk to you in a very kind and wonderful way? Uh, the experience internally is, I'm feeling good. I'm good. I'm a
It's
person who
positive reinforcement.
has value and importance and significance. And if you have a person who is, I mean, family that's very highly dysfunctional, and you don't receive that kind of information, there's a lot of negative um, associations you have about yourself as you grow up in that environment.
Well, and we look at there's been studies done like on the orphans. I think it was in Russia where they weren't like picked up and they
Right.
failed to thrive and died. I mean, it's really sad and horrible study, but it speaks to the various dynamics that influence what makes us who we are and who we become.
Right.
And there's family dynamics, there's social dynamics, there's uh, gender role dynamics.
Well,
What were
those
we
would be
talking
part of the
about? Yeah,
social dynamics,
right.
right? And there's interpersonal dynamics that we bring to our um, uh, as we bring ourselves into a situation. For instance, if we have cognitive distortions in how we interpret the world,
Hmm.
then we're going to uh, perceive the environment in a certain way that may not be the best way of perceiving. So it'll cause you to behave in a certain way that might limit your expression, true
Sure,
expression of who
sure.
you are. And then of course, there's biological dynamics where that when it connects to um, our experience of conflict and the autonomic nervous system response that we have can also um, I wouldn't say distort, but bend in a certain way our reaction that may not necessarily project who we are. Like, you'll always hear a person say when they get really angry, well, that just wasn't me,
Right.
right?
Hmm.
Or
You acted
you
differently in a
act differently,
situation.
right?
Right.
And of course, to me, and I think to you too, there's a spiritual dynamics.
Hmm.
And so as we think about these things, we're not we get a little philosophical because it's not just a question of practicality in terms of who we are, but it's in terms of the philosophy we have about how we exist and where
Hmm.
we come from,
Hmm.
and the whole ball of wax about what this experience of life is all about.
Right.
And for me, I believe that we are created beings
Hmm.
by God,
Hmm.
and in that sense, our creatureliness, our identity is connected to our Creator.
Right.
And so I have a particular way of believing what happened about that, and that informs my understanding of how identity is developed.
And because of that, that has helped to shape my view of it because
Right, because
obviously
she
I'm his kid, right?
becomes a part of my world,
And system, right?
and yeah, and the system that we live under.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about your experience as a kid growing up in the family dynamic that you had because you were the youngest. There were two siblings, you and your brother,
Hmm.
and you were raised by a mother and a father who were both oldest children. So there were three oldest children. And if anybody has ever paid any attention to um, the dynamics of birth order, it's really interesting because I'm the third of three, but there's all kinds of variants to this. But and the process that you went through and learning to express yourself through what was going on.
Right, right. So So yeah, so that it wasn't just birth order; it was also rules of the home. For instance, birth order played a very important aspect because I grew up with three oldest children, where then they had very specific ideas about how life should go.
And can before you go into that, can you give like a one sentence explanation of really kind of what birth order looks like? So if you let's say you have three
Okay,
kids,
so
right?
one sentence would be the oldest tends to be the leader and also the policeman of the family. This is in general, not
The
always.
rule enforcer.
Right, and that can be both female and male. The second is the intuitive one. Tends to be the counselor, tends to be the person who understands people's feelings, tends to be the one who also is kind of sneaky and wants to have that
Hmm.
limelight, but does it in sort of indirect ways.
Hmm.
And then the third is, and I'm gonna just go three, and also the only child. The third and the only child are very similar, and they are very creative. They tend to follow their own ideas. They tend to be um, they tend to be more individualistic, not connected that closely. So, and they tend to be the one. They can also be the mascot of the family. Now, an
Very.
only child is specific. It's a
Hmm.
little bit different in that sense of depending on the environment. And an only child grows up a lot more precocious than most kids because their friends tend to be friends of adults. They tend to speak earlier.
Hmm.
They tend to think more like adults. They tend
Hmm.
to like to be around adults. They
Hmm.
tend not to like to be around children, and they tend not to like to be told what to do as they get
Sure.
older. And they will tell you, they will engage with you as an adult, and you'll be surprised at their interaction because they will kind of engage with you that way.
So with all that said, here
And I
you
say
are.
these are general descriptions, and the differences in
Right, and there's also information that says that the further apart they are, it could be like you can have, I think it's 3.5 years.
yeah, some of that.
So if you have a child and wait 3.5 years, you kind of get another oldish child, sort of. There can be dynamics of that, and then wait 3.5 years, have another child. It can be similar to having
Well,
three
yeah, the
oldest
longer
children.
the wait, the more that it's going to be like having an only child.
Right,
Right.
or
The
yeah,
longer
only
the
child.
wait.
Right.
Right.
So here you are. You're growing up. It's the '60s and
50s, 50s to
well, 50s and
60s.
60s,
Right.
and a dynamic of two oldest children, one who is very
My father, my
authoritarian,
father,
right?
right, and then my mother was the oldest of seven in her
Mm-hmm.
family, and then my brother was older than I was, right,
Yep.
and so I was like coming along, not basically not knowing anything,
Mm-hmm.
right, and so I was the one who had to figure out how to live with three people who were going to tell me what to do all the time. And so I had to figure out how to navigate
Ay,
through
ay,
that,
ay.
right?
Right.
And so I then sort of took the back seat. Then it impacted my ability to make decisions on life.
Probably stand firmly
I
and
became very good at intuitive responses to people. I could
read
meet
them.
with people
Mm-hmm.
and be flexible. I could do all kinds of things, and people would really like me because it was easy for me to make friends with people because I was able to weave in and out.
Navigate.
I would also hide. I would be very
Mm-hmm.
hidden, and that's another thing in our home. One thing that there was a value that wasn't articulated as a value, but it became and I say values can be good or values can be bad. There can be good values and bad values. And this one was never let anyone know what is going on inside of you.
Right.
Uh,
Don't show.
don't ever show
Don't
any
emote.
don't show that you don't
And
know what you're doing,
right.
and don't show
So
weakness
there's anything bad happening. Right.
or
Right.
failure.
Right.
Right.
Everything's great. Our family's great. We have no problems. And I know this isn't just, I always understood it to be growing up in the South that it was a Southern thing, but I've come to learn that that's not just a Southern thing, that many families and cultures have that, especially uh, families that are more ethnic. There tend to be like, don't do this to the family. Don't share this with anybody. It needs to be, we need to look a certain way. And the son needs to do this, and the daughter needs to do this, and there's all sorts of
Right.
fun that goes along with it.
It was a family that had a high degree of performance.
Hmm.
And so my dad was a high performer, my mother was a high performer, and so there was a lot of intensity to it. And so and of course I had difficulty. I had learning difficulties. I was dyslexic,
Before dyslexia existed
and
as a thing.
also I was ADD,
Hmm.
right? So and we didn't know what that
And
was,
you
right?
were legally blind.
Well, I had detached two retinas. I
Right.
had detached both in both eyes. I was actually probably gifted athletically. I could move in space really well. I could draw. I didn't know that until later in life.
Hmm.
And so, but these are the factors that are part of your growing up.
Hmm.
And for instance, even though is ironically, I married into a family of artists, a
Hmm.
professional artist. My father thought that artists were lazy bums. Okay, and so and it's really interesting.
They can be, but
They,
everybody can be a
everybody
lazy
can be a
bum.
lazy bum, and he had I think in his life he wanted to be a country western singer. Yes,
Your dad,
yes, uh-huh,
really? Could he
uh-huh.
sing?
Yes, he could
He
sing.
could sing?
Yes, and he had a wonderful voice for radio too.
40 and a half years, and I had no
And
idea.
he never allowed that talent to really be expressed in his
Oh,
life.
that's sad.
Yeah, yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
man.
And so it comes down to us in a way that, and I had artistic ability. My cousins from my mother's side of the family had amazing artistic abilities, and yet it wasn't considered something to be honored or recognized,
Right. Just
and so
something
it's
there.
pushed down,
Hmm.
right? And I remember bringing a clay bust. I made a clay bust of a Greek philosopher when I was in high school. I
Hmm.
brought it home, and my parents thought this is incredible. And it looked
It
exactly
was
like,
perfect.
yeah, it's like perfect. And they
Right.
set it on the mantle for years.
Oh.
Yeah, yeah. And so, but they never really encouraged it at all. I would
Right.
sit in class and draw all the time.
So, with that, with this kind of suppression of creativity, which is such, I mean, we know now that creativity is a tool that many people use in many different ways, but therapeutically, number one.
Right,
But it absolutely is a part of the identity of the human experience.
right, right.
So, how did you go from being this kid who really kind of was being controlled all the time by the family dynamic to the person that you are today?
Well, that is part of my spiritual journey,
Yeah.
right? So, and it truly my experience of growing up in a world that was so restricted
Hmm.
um, um, created a conflict inside of me, and I became depressed and angry.
Hmm.
Um, I had difficulty in school. I didn't feel like I was successful at all.
Hmm.
I began to identify with people who were like me. That sense of group identity became a part of the formulation of my identity.
Hmm.
Along with that were behaviors, like values that I adopted,
Hmm.
were things like using drugs and smoking pot and lying
Stealing
and
and
yes,
right.
right, exactly. And so those were the values that I was actually developing. And I remember growing up and in high school, and I grew up in a southern resort town,
Hmm.
and my parents went to a very prominent church, Presbyterian church in this resort town.
The First
First Presbyterian
Presbyterian
Church of Myrtle
Church.
Beach,
Myrtle
South
Beach.
Carolina. And it's where all the elites went. And I thought their value system was stupid.
Yeah.
I adapted to the 60s and the 70s ideology
Hmm.
that was being promoted by the
Free
current
love
culture.
and
Right.
right.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Self-expression.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And
Right.
that began to, and see, that is just another uh, attempt to try to express who I was without really knowing who I was.
Hmm.
And
Of
or
course it is.
yes,
Right.
and what happened was it led more and more into a depression because there was no real true experience of authenticity
Hmm.
even then. Even though I thought I was being very authentic, um, I was in rebellion against the rules that I was living under that didn't allow me to be authentic in
Hmm.
that sense.
And I think a lot of the process of seeking and understanding who we are as individuals comes from a desire to feel like you belong.
Yes, that you feel like you belong. You're connecting with people who vibrate to your own sense of values that you have developed, and you are within a group and you're
Hmm.
accepted, right? That sense
Right.
of acceptance.
Right.
And so, with that, I even though that was taking place, it was there was no true vulnerability. Even then,
Hmm.
there was no true freedom of self-expression.
Hmm.
It's like similar to what can happen, and I've had been exposed to personal experience with this in my counseling, and where you have a young female who is in their 13 and 14 years old, and they begin to identify with the culture of adolescence, and they begin to try to um, experience authenticity through mimicking other adolescents.
Sure.
And what happens is that that's a dangerous world,
Hmm.
right? And I remember what it was like to be an adolescent. So when I was growing up, and it's even worse now, is that say you were out on the playground, right, and you were doing your thing, and you were running, and you tripped, and you fell, right? Well, most of the time, people wouldn't come over to you and say, "Are you okay? Can I
Right.
help you?" They would say, they would all laugh at you, right?
Right.
There would be this ridicule because you're growing up in a world of competition, dog eat dog, who's on top, and that's it's a power struggle from early on in existence. And see, my parents were as much a part of that power struggle in their own world as I was, and so they really couldn't understand how to influence me in a way that said, Joe, let's teach you how to not be afraid of how other
Hmm.
people react to you.
Hmm. Hmm.
You know, there was no ability by my parents to come into my life and say, these are this is what can happen. And so there's a young lady who I know very well, who was in her own middle school experience, and she began to color her hair black. She began to wear black clothes, wear black
Kind of
makeup,
goth look.
goth
Right.
look, black makeup on her eyes, and what her and so she was on her iPad all the time.
Hmm.
And so what happened was that uh, her father decided to pull her out of school and then start homeschooling her, and and through that process of being in the home and having that sort of loving context in the home, she began to change.
Hmm.
And she was so creative in terms of her own abilities to do things. Like she would make costumes, incredible costumes.
Hmm.
And her dad calls me one day and he says, "Guess what my daughter is doing?" This is like a month afterwards, and she was also depressed. She was on medication,
Wasn't she pulling her hair out?
pulling her hair
They
out.
found bald spots.
Right, right.
Right.
And
shared this story with
and
me.
so she and her dad calls me about a month later, and she says, "You'll never guess what she's doing." And I said, "What?" And he goes, "She's in her bedroom in her banana costume, creating new costumes."
That's awesome.
And see, you would, as an adolescent, you would never do that in the presence of other adolescents.
Right.
That's too
It's
dangerous.
too dangerous.
Who you are. And there's a really good book that describes this process. It's called
Hold on to your kids.
Hold On to Your Kids.
I knew
Right.
where he was going with that. It's
Right.
very good. I've read it. It's
Very,
very,
very
very
good book
good.
that describes that the culture that our kids are in and the need for parent involvement in their life, right? In a good way.
Mhm.
I just came back from a camp uh, with
Father-son
Ashley's
camp.
husband Matt and the three boys, and it was so wonderful to see this camp where fathers and sons, that's it, fathers and sons, up until about 14, I
I think
think,
so.
just having games and playing together and building things together and uh,
Mhm.
laughing together. And it's the building
With
that,
all the pressure
with all the
off.
pressure off, right? And it's just a wonderful time
There's no
of,
schedule of having to get to bed
right,
or,
right.
clean up or do any, yeah.
Yeah, and it was just an absolute blast. And of
Mhm.
course, there was that spiritual element too that talks about the importance of having those good relationships
Yeah.
too.
It's interesting. I'll share this and then we'll move on to what we want to talk about here. One thing before I got pulled out to be homeschooled in seventh grade that um, I had I had a really amazing upbringing. I'll talk about them as if you didn't know. And the kind of influence that I had with parents who had gone through the struggle of figuring things out and not having the structure that they needed as kids. But um, in seventh grade, I started the trend of hugging at the end of the day. So literally, I'd say, "Give me a hug," and it spread through our school, and it was the craziest thing. So we were all hugging each other at the end of the day, and it was just a wonderful, positive thing. And it's funny to think back. I hadn't thought about that. I was like, "Oh, that came
That's
to me,"
cool.
and not caring
Right.
or caring so much about going, you know what, I care about good things.
Right.
I care about people treating other people well. And it was everybody. You
Right.
didn't exclude anybody. It wasn't just you hugging your friends. You
Right.
hugged everybody in the classroom.
Right.
And it was really an amazing thing to see happen.
And it's interesting as you grow and as you begin to trust yourself,
Mm-hmm.
right, with uh, sort of the intuitive responses that you have inside of you. Um, there can be times when you will confront issues in a way that might ruffle other people and might go in a direction that could cause problems for you.
I have done that myself many times.
But there's a lot of it that has to do with expressing yourself in a way that where you will do things that other people will go, wow, I really appreciate you doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And there's that element that's so important that we will, in our minds, will go, should I do this? It's kind of weird.
Mm-hmm.
It's not.
You question
You begin to
yourself,
question
doubt
yourself,
yourself.
and you will probably a lot of times you'll say, no, I'm not going to do it.
Right. You talk yourself out of it.
Talk yourself out of it, and that's a real mistake. It's now don't get me wrong. There are times when your fight flight system is engaged and you're angry and you're controlled by fear
Mm-hmm.
in some way, and a lot of people think, well, my self-expression is then, when really it's not. When you're connected, unless you're actually being attacked by somebody, or then you want to get out of there or fight for your life. But in most cases, when you're finding yourself in an argument and people say, well, I'm going to tell you who
On
I am.
Facebook, on social
I'm
media.
right there's
And I'm going to tell you who you are.
that's really not necessarily connected to your self-expression.
Right.
Because self-expression is connected to an aspect of you that has a loving sense to it
Mm-hmm.
toward other people. and
That
not
is
trying to get rid of them or try to control them or make them feel a certain way.
that has been a big shift in how I do things just over the last maybe year and a half, 2 years. I, not to say that I'm perfect by any stretch of the imagination in this, because I'm absolutely not. But, and even just last week, I did something really idiotic. Anyway, that I was cringing over. I reacted, right? But as I moved my thinking more towards what is the truth, not my truth, what is the truth, what is good, what is right. And obviously, my faith has a huge role in deducting those
Right.
things,
Mm-hmm.
but
Deducing them.
deducing,
Mm-hmm.
deducing,
You don't want to deduct them.
deduct. Right. I don't want to take one. Right.
Well, I guess
I
maybe
don't want. Well, yeah, breaking down the
breaking down. Mm-hmm.
understanding of what I'm trying to figure out,
Mm-hmm.
right, and separating things out and going, okay, is this what I want to be doing? That has been the biggest game changer in how I interact with people, and it doesn't necessarily make it easier. I've still had to have hard conversations.
Mm-hmm.
I've still had to address things that feel really uncomfortable that I would rather run and hide from. Um, but boy, oh boy, does it change your perspective. It feels less like nails coming at, or,
Right.
sharp, this
Right.
intensity, and more a level of peace going, I'm okay with this. I'm going to respond to this situation in a way that I feel is good and true and right.
And not only that, I think that when you say having hard conversations with people, already you're feeling the warfare that could occur.
Right.
And the warfare means that the other person can be perceived as the enemy very quickly. And what you try to do is not see the other person as the enemy. You try to see the other person as a friend.
And try and find something that you agree with.
And try to something and you can agree with, so that you can interact in a way that's not connected to that autonomic nervous system response,
Mm-hmm.
because the other person will pick up on it pretty easily. And see, and I don't want, and the formation, and I think a lot of young people today are, and a lot of adults too, in terms of their marriages and interpersonal interactions with each other, but there's a lot of what's called formation reaction. And so there's this sense of, I'm going to show you who I am, kind
Mm-hmm.
of approach
Mm-hmm.
that is really not, because it's not balanced.
Right.
There's no balance in that approach. It's just like, I'm going to force you into a position of seeing me in a particular way, right?
Right.
And that
And
is
even out victim you.
right, right,
Because
and
you
of
don't
course,
understand
because
my oppression.
of course right, well, of course the dynamic of superiority in our culture
In virtue signaling.
is to be a victim.
Yes.
Let me say that again. The dynamic of superiority in our culture is to be a victim.
Yeah.
And that's a formation reaction that is born out of the sort of the uh, uh, experience of not having an identity and wanting people to look at you in a particular way
And control their thinking.
and try to control their thinking.
Paint the picture for them of what you believe they should see.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of parent-adolescent dynamics occur in that respect. I know this is not necessarily a parenting segment,
Well,
but
it can be applied.
yeah, it can be applied.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, so that's the there's so much more to this, and I haven't gone into the aspect of how, or we haven't gone in the aspect of how our spiritual life um, helps us develop our identity,
Mm-hmm.
and what is needed in order to connect with that, because truly what the dynamic is, as we reflect this stuff in our daily life toward each other, the dynamic between our creator and who we are becomes primary in terms of how we interact with other people. And if we don't have a connection, a relationship between ourselves and the creator, then then that's going to then leave us from my perspective, at a disadvantage in knowing how to interact with others, because we won't see them as also connected to the creator in a way that is similar to our connection.
Mm-hmm.
So having that relationship dynamic, and I won't go into it today, but having that relationship dynamic between a human and the creator is essential in understanding our identity. I think that's my experience.
Totally agree. I think that for anyone listening who doesn't have a strong faith, like deeply rooted faith, if you can, and this not, I don't know, just thinking of this while you were talking, but if you can imagine having a parent, I was thinking mother, because that's, you grow in your mother's womb, right? A mother, and if you can for a second disconnect from any level of dysfunction that you've experienced in your life and any flaws that you know about your mother, but imagine a mother who's really perfect, right? And she's raised you, and all she wants is good things for you, and her behavior has always been right on track and has shown you, she's always there for you despite your behavior, despite the missteps. And imagine that you have this parent that exists, but you have no relationship with that person. And let's say you're adopted, right? This is where the analogy kind of breaks down, right? So you are unable to, like, you've only heard these things about this mother who grew you, and oh my goodness, how do I have a relationship with this person so that I can understand better who I am? And that's a little bit, if you can sort of wrap your head around, that's what it is, sort of.
Kind of, yes,
Sort of,
right.
right.
And let me tell you a story that kind of sums it up.
All right.
So I was a number of years ago. We would go to from Myrtle Beach. We lived in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, and it was in July when we would take our short vacations, and we would go to the mountains of North Carolina and near Blowing Rock and Boone every year, and we um, discovered a festival that was up there called the Highland Games. And of course, our last name is Johnston, and it's a Scottish name, and so we really kind of felt really connected, and so eventually we got our kilts and the whole bit, and the whole regalia, and feel which is a part of having an identity, right?
Mhm.
And so we travel up there, and one year I really wanted to have the best experience. So I bought the best tickets, the closest parking spots. Thousands of people go to this, and the closest parking. And I got ribbons that would allow us into most of the venues, And so we got up there. I was in the kilts and everything, and we got up. It took about an hour and a half, 2 hours to get up there because of so many people, and on Grandfather Mountain in North Carolina. And so we got up there, parked, felt really good. Got to the parking spot, no one else has it, it's like everybody else has a lesser parking.
You're the VIP.
The VIP, right? So, and I get out of the car, I realize I don't have my ribbon. I have no ribbon.
Your tickets, right?
It's basically a ticket to get in, right? And so Betsy had hers, my wife had hers, and the whole family had theirs. And so we go to the entrance of the festival, and of course I had to explain I didn't have a ribbon. And of course, I had the car tag. I had their
And this is
ribbons.
before iPhones, where you're like, here's the proof that I
Right,
purchased it.
right.
Right.
No,
This
it's
is
none of
before
that. And so the person says, "Well, I'm sorry, you can't get in." And it's
Like a
like,
kick in the teeth.
it's like, you're
Ugh.
standing there before God's kingdom gates, and you're going, "What do you mean? I've done all what I'm supposed to do, right?" It says you can't get in, and so, um, and then I said, "Really?" I said, I have to go. It's going to take me 3.5 hours to go back down and come back up. That's going to be really, and I won't be able to find anybody. And the guy, he said, "Okay." He says, "I'll tell you what you can do. You can go straight across the field to the police tent, and they will tell you what to do." And so I, like a Boy Scout, I go straight across the field. Don't veer to the right. Don't veer to the left. Go straight across the field. I'm standing outside waiting to get in, and there's this guy comes out, and he's like looking really depressed. It's like he's had a bad day in the police tent. And so I go in, and there was a highway patrolman in there, and I told him my predicament, and he looks at me and he goes, "Who are you?" And I told him my name. He says, "Where are you from?" I told him where I was from. He says, he gives me all this third degree, like I was,
Like you're a
I was like a
criminal.
criminal.
Right.
I was
Yeah.
a criminal in his eyes, And he says, and I'm feeling really bad. Mentally, I'm feeling bad.
Disappointed in yourself.
Right.
Annoyed.
And it's like, why did I leave it down
Right.
there? And he thinks I'm a criminal. He thinks I'm cheating. He thinks I'm lying. I'm a liar. I'm all this stuff. And so he goes, "Wait a minute." He goes back in the back. He comes out. He says, "Here." He says, "If you don't bring this back to me by the end of the day, I'm going to put an all points bulletin out of you. I'm going to arrest you. I'm going to take you to jail." That was his friendly response. Right? There's the law of God. The law of God will reveal to you your inadequacy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I put that ribbon on, and I walked outside, and I was so depressed because my reputation was besmirched.
Right.
I felt like I was
You were just reprimanded.
reprimanded for no good reason.
Well,
right?
You fell short of your own standards.
Right.
Which is, yeah.
And so the thing is that the ribbon he gave me was a ribbon I could get into any venue, behind stages. I had access to everything better than my ribbon had.
Crazy.
And during that, this is the struggle that we have. During that period of time, I was struggling with the thought that I had the freedom to go anywhere I wanted, and the feeling of condemnation inside. And God just says to me, "Joe, this is an illustration of how I am with you. I will give you freedom if you trust me, and not to live by those rules in your head." That is so important to really understand the freedom that I have for you.
Absolutely.
And so when we experience that relationship with God, that's what it's like.
Yeah.
That Creator.
Yeah.
Right.
That's good.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us, everybody. This is Growing Pains, and we hope you got something from this. As always, feel free to drop us a comment, like, share, follow, and we'll see you next time.
All right. Bye.
Bye.